of introduction. I was thinking maybe I should go and listen to the other keynote. But, I thank ECER also for inviting me to give this keynote address. It's wonderful to be in Yerevan, really charming city I found, wonderful to be in Armenia. And I was saying to Maria, when I was asked to give a keynote this year, I actually gave a keynote at ECER in 1999 in Lahti in Finland. And I went to look at what I'd spoken about there, and it was at the peak of globalisation, high globalisation, and I spoke about how that played out in education. And just thinking, and this was serendipitous, that what I'm doing today, I suppose, is looking at what's happened since then and changing relations. So I'll build on research I've done over the last decade, but I'll be dealing with theory and implicitly the empirical, because I reject theoreticism without the empirical and empiricism without the theoretical as well. My title, the first part of it, of course, plays off the theme of the conference, so the impacts, plural, of changing global realities, and I'll talk about those, changing global, national relations, the nature of them, the direction of them, local, global, etc. And the impact on education. My own research over the last couple of decades has been mainly on education policy, but I'll consider, and I'd like you to keep thinking about these as I speak, the implications for educational research. I always make a distinction between education research, which I see as the application of social science theories and methodologies to a topic broadly defined of education, or educational research, which I think has a more normative purpose. But in my view, all research, all good research, all education research is about understanding and enhancing it. And that, I think, ipso facto, should lead to trying to constitute better futures. And I'll come back to that. As well as dealing with those changing global realities, I will also look at datification, digitalisation, and work I've been doing in this domain recently, because I think, as Sasson says, that the creation of infrastructures of various kinds, data infrastructures, digital infrastructures, has been central to the constitution of what we think of as the global. The subtitle of my talk's taken from Arjun Padurai's 2013 book, The Future as Cultural Fact, and in it, in the conclusion in particular, he juxtaposes two ways of thinking about how we might create the future. And he works with the notion that we don't prepare for the future, we seek to create it. And he talks of an ethics of probability, which comes out of statistics and probability, which almost assumes a continuity between yesterday, tomorrow, and so on. And he juxtaposes it against an ethics of possibility, which is where humans democratically, inclusively together work out the sort of future they want. He puts this as a binary. In my conclusion, I will reject the binary and say we have to work across both. And I think even in the short time when that book was published, 2013, that artificial intelligence has pushed on considerations of an ethics of probability with machine learning, the work of algorithms, and so on. So basically, I will deal in part one with global, national, changing global realities, and in part two, datification and digitalisation. And I will come back to think about the future, particularly in relation to that Padurai binary. So we know global national relations have been changing, and I suppose up until the end of the Cold War, education was the prerogative of the nation or national units within it. Globalisation challenged that, think of the UN's SDGs. So we had a challenge. In theory, in the social sciences, there was a spatial turn and multiple ways to try to understand the impact of globalisation within nations and the local. In the global field, Bourdieu, Brenner, rescaling the topological, the notion of relations being as significant as locations, Uri's work, world society, Mayer, and the Stanford School, the cultural flowscapes of the Padurai, the old policy transfer, nation to nation policy learning, but the more recent, Peck and Theodore and others, of course, policy mobilities, the notion of policies moving across the globe, but mutating as they move, and then touching down in systems and then affected by path dependency, so we see hybrid outcomes. But of course, recently, we've seen the rise of new forms of nationalism, ethno-nationalism. Trump, America first, anti-multilateralism. UK, Johnson, Brexit, anti-multilateralism. It's a joy to think that they're in the past, but that's a positive. But I think those new nationalisms, right-wing populism, still works, of course. So my argument will be that we need to go beyond a binary in our methodologies in education research of methodological nationalism and methodological globalism. And of course, the state inside the nation it has been central to the constitution of the global, as well as the global seeing the reworking of the state. Papanastadou talks about the scale-craft work of policymakers within nations. In a recent paper with a couple of colleagues, we've written also about spacecraft. The way OECD's ECER, which creates a global space of commensurate measurement, how that was pushed by the US, and now nations work particular forms of spacecraft as well. So prior to the end of the Cold War, just to say something in a little more detail, education policy, education research, I think, implicitly at least, took the nation as the unit of analysis, assuming the social and the society, the political and the society were homologous with the nation. And of course we know historically that schooling was central through mass literacy and, I would argue, mass numeracy in creating the imagined community which is the nation. So in that context, education policy, education research was almost seen as the exclusive function of the nation state. And what we had methodologically was methodological nationalism, which Beck wrote about in that paper in Theory, Culture and Society, and critiqued it in the context of global pressures. But there was an assumption that humanity was divided into a limited number of nations with boundaries. And of course what the global was doing is not eviscerating, but smoothing over some of the bumps of boundaries. And globalisation therefore challenged methodological nationalism. And so if we go back a moment to the impact of the end of the Cold War, we have a whole lot of hubristic writing. Apadarai, in Modernity at Large, talks about a post-national world. Of course, two of his subsequent books, Fear of Small Numbers and The Future is Cultural Fact, go back on that and saying that was an overstatement. Fukuyama, perhaps the strongest statement, that US liberal democracy was the end of politics in the world, and of course it was always absurd, that observation. But nation states as tightly bordered and bounded challenged Padarai's flows, the flows of ethnoscapes, people, finance-scapes and so on, ideas-scape, the flows of policymakers. Carney and Ball speak of policy-scapes, looking at the work of OECD, UNESCO, so a challenge to methodological nationalism. But my last point here is one that I will make over and over, and I want you to take away from what I'm trying to argue, that the nation-state across all of this remained important, but it works in different ways as the global continues to change. So it works in multiple ways. The way it's imbricated in multiple directions in supranational organisations like the EU, international organisations like UNESCO. There's new regionalisms in Australia and Asia, APEC. There's global policy fields, a rescaling of the state, and so on. So, since the beginning of this century, national policies in many nations are linked in binding chains of transnational framings. And I think European nations, it's interesting to think of OECD, EU, and how those transnational ideas, concepts, measurements and so on flow into the national. But of course, the dominant discourse globally was human capital theory. We heard it yesterday, the Minister talking about the future of schooling in Armenia, about developing better human capital. And that education policy was seen as a way to ensure the national competitiveness of the national economy globally. But of course, those And there were other purposes of schooling, some of which I've listed there. And I think the focus on learning rather than curriculum allows comparisons across nations and flows as well. But always, any of these global flows, when they hit nations, the path dependencies always play out there. But, as Clark argues, that what we saw with this globalisation, Europeanisation, regionalisation, was an unsettling of the assumed unities of place, people and policy. You know, think of a school. Some of the young people there will be migrants. Think of the school being involved in PISA testing or Tims and Pearls. So there was an unsettling, and those ideas were associated with methodological nationalism. But Clark rightly argues that there's a potential for methodological globalism, a flat world, free ideas of flowing to replace it, and there's problems with that. Now, if we come to the politics, and I mentioned something about this earlier, but the rise of neoliberal globalisation and then the rise of new right-wing populist opposition, Johnson, Trump, etc., and parties within most nations, however small or large, that opposition to globalisation has been manifest as a surreptitious form of racism within the nation and ethno-nationalism which others, those who are different, while leaving intact fully the whole neoliberal, which the left critiques, Piketty and Savage. And I love those two books in terms of what they tell us about what's happened under the dominant global flow of neoliberal ideology. And Peck and Theodore, who are very important in terms of fast policy making, policy mobilities, they say the imaginaries of policymakers within nations have been debordered. Research we've done with policymakers at OECD and in Australia, we found something of an alignment between the habitus of those in Australia and those. So, and this is where policy-making imaginaries debordered. But they make the point, they always emphasise mobility, fixity, and I'd say the fixity bit, as the global flows hit nations, path dependency mediates. So enactment of policy remains a stubbornly localised, context-specific thing. Now, why has high globalisation not continued? What's interrupted it? In two of his recent books, Apadarai says, yes, there's global flows, but there's now also global bumps, as there's been some rebordering around some sort of policy domains. And so here I see the challenges to that hyper-globalisation, the flat world thesis, Thomas Friedman, the rise of religion, nationalism, ethno-nationalism, Russia's position in the world, USA's position, the rise of China. And so what we have, I think, as Crowley and colleagues argue now, in terms of all of these flows in the global, is a way in which borders between the national, the international, the global, supranational, they take many forms and vary sector by sector. Think of taxation, usually bounded within the nation. Think of the climate emergency. I mean, the policy in a sense has to be global. But think of COVID. I mean, we might see it in Apadarai's terms as a viral escape. But what did nations do? Certainly my nation, Australia, was close borders. So my point is that with the rise of nationalism, new nationalisms, ethno-nationalisms, that there's different bordering in different policy domains and different sectors of policy and in different policies within education, and I think that's an empirical issue. There's some theory we could look at here, and I've always liked very much this Larson and Beach paper from Comparative Education Review. It's a bit old now, and I'm actually working with Jason Beach and trying to update it. We're going to take a while to do that, but they argue that place as local and space as global were the master narratives in most of the literature looking at the impacts of globalisation on education. So the focus tended to be, they argued, the way the global came into the nation and was mediated. The emphasis was on the global and the national or the local, with the latter, the nation and the local, conceptualised as place and the global as space. And they argue, and I would agree with them 100%, that we need to go beyond the simple binary of place, space, local, global, etc. And we have to look at the way education systems, and I suppose our research is situated in multiple geographies of power, multiple cartographies. I mean, Massey picked this up beautifully a long time ago now, where she says place, that is the local, in the dominant trope, exists in networks of relations, quote, constructed on a far larger scale than what we happen to define for that moment as the place itself. Interestingly, Wedge, who writes about on YouTube, talks about, and I think you can take it to the internet, Instagram, Twitter, talks about how there's a context collapse. And some theorist, Armin, has argued that the ontological distinction between place as local and space has been overcome through the global and the technologies, which I'll come to in the second part of the talk. So there's a reworking of place, space, scale, statecraft, and spacecraft, and borders now taking many forms. So rebordering, debordering, and so on. How do we theorise this? And I'm not going to talk about these, but it's just interesting to me. Once I would take one position, I've always used the sort of Borgerian and arguing there's an emergent global policy field in education. But I think, having done more empirical work, that there's something that could be brought to bear on what I know from various theories. And I was always someone who didn't particularly like the world society argument, because I think it left out politics. You know, the argument that there's an isomorphism, irrespective of the nature of the society, between education systems, how they're structured, how curriculum is structured. The global policy fields, Brenner's rescaling, who talks about a rescaling of the state. The topological, which argues that its relations now enabled by technologies which are as significant as location. Schools in nations participating in PISA for schools and comparing their performance with schools in 15 other nations. A new set of relations rather than locations. The cultural flows of the Padarai, policy diffusion, and I said something about policy mobilities. So, what does this mean? What are the impacts? What's the impact of these changes on education, education policy, education and educational research? Now, I've been thinking about this, and there's a lot more I could say, and I hope you take this a bit further as well. But I would argue that we need to go beyond methodological nationalism and methodological globalism in terms of our methodologies. We need to consider the specificities of each empirical research case, the local, the place that we're researching, and think of how borders and links beyond that place might work, and how there's differing borders, and there's always path dependency when the global hits the national and the local. We can't assume that society and the social are homologous with the nation or the subnational. I mean, you just think, all of you probably email and tweeting people all around the world, as all of us do every day, that sort of context collapse, which has been enabled, precipitated by new technologies. We must take, I would argue, multiple geographies and cartographies of education and education policy into consideration. And the relations between global, national, local go in multiple relations, multiple directionalities. And all of these things affect the nation, but it remains important, but is continually reconstituted and works in different ways. There's implications for our concepts. I've always loved that Nancy Fraser 2013 book on the significance of globalisation for feminist policies and theorising feminism. And she argues that the post-Westphalian, the global, is significant for doing both things. And I think that's an example how the things I'm talking about even affect our theoretical tools, our topics, of course, our theories, of course, and our methodologies, of course. And I think Burrawoy's extended case methodology, some of the work that in comparative ed that Vavros and Bartlett have written about the significance of context, Peck and Theodore in Fast Policy, the chapter they have on their methodology, I think in its openness, honesty, and the difficulties of doing what they were doing in new sort of spaces, I think, is exemplary. So it's, and like Bourdieu said something about this, that our research is always messy, difficult, we make choices here and don't, and that has to come through, that writing up our research, it shouldn't be like a performance on the stage where you try to get rid of all the props, you actually have to articulate them so it's open, transparent. So, this is a bit of self-publicising, sorry. The book, Reimagining Globalisation in Education, has just very recently come out, and I edited it with colleagues Fazil Rizvi and Risto Rini, and it looks at those things that I've mentioned, the rise of new nationalism and ethno-nationalism, and I think the final chapter by my colleague Fazil on how that's working in relation to the global, the national and education policy is really worth reading. The other book which I edited, my opening essay, really deals with the things I've been talking about to date. So I want to come now to part two, and the link is that the global has really been facilitated by those technological changes, advances, the computational capacities. So I'm going to talk about datification and all this quite quickly. And I read all of this. I did some pure maths in my degree, and I had an idea of what algorithms were. But when I look at AI and the role of algorithms, I find it very difficult to understand how they work. I ask all the experts, and they seem to be about as clear as I am. So some of the things here I've been thinking about for a long time, talking with colleagues. But I think it's important to think about datification, digitalisation, and the emerging modes of educational governance which come from those things. And I think they have impacts on education policy, and indeed our research. If we put all of this in the bigger context, and I'm not going to go through these, but you would know Powers Audit Society. Like I stayed in Mau's, the Metric Society. I stayed in a hotel for a night in Dubai. When I arrived here, I had this survey, and I had to give. And in actual fact, when I left, they gave me a card and told me if I thought the hotel was great. Could I go onto TripAdvisor? I had all the steps to. There's a way in which sociology has become every day. And there's surveys everywhere as part. And Audit Society, of course, is the way the public sector works. Through new public management steering at a distance and so on. Thrift's knowing capitalism, that capitalism becomes a product of itself. Anything you buy or do is this surveying of what you're doing. Zubov's book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, the notion that our data is captured and monetized. And she shows quite clearly how Google, earlier this century, got out of the financial hole by becoming aware that all the data they had could be monetized and so on. And there's a lovely philosophical chapter in that book where she talks about the rendering of experience as data. And she asks the deep question of can and should all experience be rendered as data? And I think that's interesting in respect of schooling. And the governance of schooling systems. Nick Coldray and Mageas, theirs is a sort of, I think, maybe even stronger articulation of the Zuboff position. They argue that these things in our computer activity, online activity, is colonising our human life for capitalism, and everything we do is being monetised for somebody, for some benefit for somebody. And I think in this context of those broader social changes, how do they work through schooling systems? Another set of questions. But individuals, we are being constituted and reconstituted in all of this as constellations of data points over time. And it impacts on school system and new modes of governance. So datification refers to the rendering of various aspects of experience as data. Policy, schooling, teachers, teachers' work, students, the philosophical issue I mentioned, and of course the big thing is the digitalisation of that data. And the conversion of data into digital form, and particularly when we get to big data, more about it in one moment, enables machine learning, AI, and the work of algorithms here, and potentially predictive governance, governing the future, constituting the future. And digital data infrastructures have been centrally important here. But one of the big issues here, of course, is private ed tech companies are involved here. And of course, when you datify experience, some things are left out and bracketed out. And who's doing that when the ed tech companies are involved in the creation for some systems of these data infrastructures, philanthropies as well. It used to be statisticians that did the work around policy and ministries of education. Now it's much more data scientists and working with different constructions of probability. So we've got ever-enhancing computational capacity, and I think back to when I gave that keynote in 1999, we're in a totally different world, and we just take for granted what we do now, but it's all quite recent, isn't it? So that schooling systems are now heavily datified and the data digitalised. And there's two potential moves on. Now I should say that these are emergent and they're more advanced in some systems and some societies than others. But I think it's the direction that things are going in relation to datification. The one is the potential move from the collection of discrete sets of data, a one-off national test, on 2 days of the year, or PISA on 1 day of the year, to the potential collection of continuous real-time data. Yep, the first. The second, linked, is the move from a sort of discrete sample data to census data. And I think those moves and the digitalisation of the data leads to AI, machine learning, and particular modes of predictive governance. Some would argue, and Freitas has, that our understanding of the human and social with implications for research means that we've got to shift our ontological and epistemological assumptions. Now, there's a lot one could talk about there, and I'm not going to. You can think about it. I think what we've got in systems right now is the simultaneity of Foucault's disciplinary society, the top-down panopticon of control through sort of test-based modes of accountability, high-stakes testing, steering at a distance, and so on. So that notion of, and I think that continues clearly. But I think at the same time we have the emergence of Deleuze's control society, continuous assessment, the move from discrete collection of data to the collection of real-time continuous data, and the move from sample to big data. And there's a bit, and so I think what we've got now is the working together of disciplinary and control society in different stages of emergence in schooling systems. And of course those things don't just work within nations or the subnational, they work globally, supranationally, and so on. So I'll say something very quickly about data infrastructure, datified bodies and datified modes of governance. Data infrastructures have been central, I think, to the enabling of the things I'm talking about. Socio-technical assemblages of people, computing, software and hardware. And we've got the mass datification of schooling and the digitalisation of that data. Even though I feel at the moment in many systems they're drowning in data which isn't being analysed, and I know schools get concerned about that. The processes of data infrastructure see new types of professionals, the data scientists and so on. And of course, data flows in many directions, from the international organisation to the nation back there, a system to a school to system. It enables the flows and the workings of data. And look, there's things that I'm not talking about regulations of this within nations. And all of that works differently. I've done a bit of research in Japan, where legislation, it seems to me the way it currently exists, might inhibit the development of AI in public sector policies, because their legislation says data that's collected can only be used for the purposes for which it was collected, which would seem to inhibit its putting those big data sets in education together with the big data sets in health and policing and so on. But that's another set of things which I'm not going to say anything about. I made the Sasson point about globalisation being the creation of global data infrastructures. And they're constituted, of course. Consider how school performance, teacher performance, student learning, teachers' work are captured and translated. And captured is an interesting word, I think. And of course, it's the point of what isn't captured, and who decides what is captured, and how does that work, and what implications might there be for our research. If we look at datafied bodies, there's significant datification of education. Human bodies, professional bodies, bodies of data. And I think there's almost a sight of surveillance from human bodies to bodies of data. New ways of disciplining and controlling teachers, the remaking of teachers in the image of data, disciplining of teachers. Potentially, with the disciplinary and control of society, teachers' bodies become a site of intervention. The classroom would be no longer the space of just the professional teacher, but the fishbowl that exposes them to constant observation and auditing. The same for students. Compliance-based, a teacher's body of data, the news site of an inspectorial gaze, data valence, liquid surveillance. And that point I made before about the flows of data enabled by data infrastructures in multiple directions. Ian Hardy and Stephen Lewis in the paper in 2017 in the British Journal of Sociology of Education talk about the double think of data. And they're talking about the disciplinary society and the national test in Australia. So the students do the test in the schools, the teachers oversee it, it goes back to the system, then the system uses it to hold teachers to account. So there's this double think going on of data. Now, what about datafied modes of governance? Of course, there's a long history. Think of statistics. Literally, statistics are state numbers, which is a whole lot of very interesting literature about Nicholas Rose, but many others. Society is known in one sense through statistics. And AI extends this through access to big data, census data, and then the use of algorithms. And we're moving potentially to a sort of mode of digital governance in education, anticipatory, synthetic. My colleagues, Cal Gulson, Sam Seller and Taylor Webb, in their recent book, The Algorithms of Education, which I encourage you all to read, they talk about anticipatory and synthetic governance as a mode of digital governance which is emerging. And this is where human cognition and machine cognition and learning come together. And where that goes, old notions of probability, of course, don't they statistically assume that tomorrow is like yesterday because all your data is collected in the past. One of the things they're suggesting, and I've had long conversations with them about this, is they think that there's the potential with AI and machine learning, machine cognition, to find things that we didn't know, which might open up possibilities. But of course, governance still it's not solely through numbers, big data, and the things I'm talking about, but through examples, reviews, etc. I just put this up as an example of algorithms in education. We know the move to computer adaptive testing. So all the students do the set of questions A, then depending on how they perform, an algorithm pushes those who've done well to a harder set of questions D and those who haven't to an easier set of questions B. And then depending on how the two groups do there, an algorithm then, at the second branching point, makes a decision that some will go to the really challenging items, some will be pushed to mainstream, and some to easier. And this is a response to the argument that those who do outstandingly, the test tells you nothing, those who do poorly, the test tells you nothing. Supposedly, the use of algorithms here, you'll get information which might be more useful for people in schools, teachers in relation to pedagogy. And I just put that up as an example. I've taken it from the national testing in Australia and the moves to online computer adaptive testing, which in the first year were a disaster because many schools' power went down, there were all sorts of problems with it. But it's that sort of testing that the US and the federal department have criticised PISA about, saying if only the member countries participated, you could go to a sort of computer adaptive testing with PISA, which was an argument put under the anti-multilateralism cover of President Trump. So what are the impacts of these things on education and educational research? The topics of research enables new data sets, the size of data sets. There's that famous paper by Mike Savage where he went to a conference talking about methodologies, and a guy stood up from British Telecom and said, we have all the data on every telephone conversation in the UK for the last 10 years. And he thought, my God, what's my sample survey? How does it match this? And there's some implications here for research. Links to the changing realities and relations of global, national, local implications, context collapse, global data infrastructures. There's implications for our theories and methodologies. Now, I used to think 10, 15 years ago that when my doctoral students had to do literature reviews, it was much more difficult than when I did it, because when I did it, there wasn't as much literature. But what do I find now? They all, of course, do their literature reviews through computer searches. There's a way in which these things I'm talking about are playing into education research and how we do our research. With a colleague, Asper Baritsis, we've been analysing the media representations from 2000 to the present in Australia of Australia's changing PISA performance, and we can go to a database, Factiva. So there's and the way we do searches for various things, and so on. Some of the things I talked about there in the chapter I did with Stephen Lewis and Jessica Holloway in that book I've done with Fazil and colleagues. And I've written about this with two other colleagues from Australian Catholic University, Claire White-Smith and Elizabeth Heck, a paper we did on these things for UNESCO, and a book we edited with Routledge, which deals with some of the things I've just been talking about. So I want to come to some concluding comments, and I'm not going to do the sort of traditional conclusion of summarising all the things I've said. I'll leave that to you. What I want to do is take up one point, one of the ones I made at the beginning, that education research really is about understanding, and it's about helping to constitute a future. And I want to come back to the Apadarai, ethics of probability, ethics of possibility, and I want to pluralise both, ethics of probabilities and ethics of possibilities. But I think Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century, the last sentence of the book says this: refusing to deal with numbers rarely serves the interests of the least well off. And I think it's salutary to think about it. And I was for years in Australia involved in the management committees of something called the Disadvantaged Schools Program, which poured redistributed money into the schools serving the poorest 15% of kids. And I think the only way we could do that was through numbers, knowing which kids, through the data, So I think this isn't a sort of anti-numbers or anti-quantitative qualitative. My view is that your theoretical frame and your research frame, the onto-epistemologies, have to link to the research topic and what you want to do with it, rather than there being some doctrinaire commitment to one or the other. I might have said that 30 years ago, I have to say, to be honest. But I'm arguing we have to go beyond an ethics of probability and an ethics of possibility, and I'll come back to that. And I'll say something about the Golson synthetic governance and Aroldi's recent book on machine habitus, where I think he's talking about what Golson and colleagues call synthetic governance. So they're the two books I'm dealing with, The Algorithms of Education and Apatterei. So if we come to Apatterei, he juxtaposes, right, a useful binary, but I think we need to go beyond. By an ethics of possibility, I mean those ways of thinking, feeling and acting that increase the horizons of hope, that expand the field of imagination, that produce greater equity and what I call the capacity to aspire. And of course that book is about, yes, to overcome poverty and its impacts on schooling. In my example, you have to confront material inequalities directly, but he also argues you have to build in such young people a notion that they can aspire for a better future and to make a better world. That produce greater equity in what I call the capacity to aspire, and that widen the field of informed, creative and critical citizenship. Then he juxtaposes this against the ethics of probability. By the ethics of probability, I mean those ways of thinking, feeling and acting that flow out of what Ian Hacking called the avalanche of numbers. And I think some of those early Hacking books and writing are absolutely brilliant. Or what Michel Foucault saw as the capillary dangers of modern regimes of diagnosis, counting and accounting. Now, I think it's not either or, and what I'll go on to say is that ethics of probability, I think now, with big data, enhanced computational capacities, the use of algorithms, machine learning, artificial intelligence, that maybe the ethics of probabilities work in different ways. It's interesting, when I was thinking about this, I was thinking of UNESCO's, that somebody mentioned yesterday, that wonderful new report of theirs, The Futures of Education. It's very much within an ethics of possibilities. And I mean, what's interesting to me, there's no figures or data, it's all words and trying to restructure, reconstitute a sort of humanist framing for schooling, I suppose. And if you juxtapose that with the OECD's recent, and it's a whole project, The Future of Education in Schools 2030, I think what you see clearly is an ethics of possibility in UNESCO and an ethics of probabilities in the OECD, which tries to reconstitute human capital theory. You know, the question of the three literacies of PISA, do you add more measures, global competence, etc., and also trying to predict the future out of statistics. There's a brilliant paper by Susan Robertson that just came out in Global Society, where she doesn't deal with those two reports, but she does a comparison of the dispositions, theoretically, research-wise, politically, of UNESCO and of the OECD, and works with those two ethics. But my point is we need to go beyond them, working them together, and accept that numbers and data are helpful and necessary. But I've always thought, and these are the discussions I have with my colleagues, and people who know more about mathematics than I do, but I've always thought that probability assumed a continuity between the past, present and future, and the data collected in the past retrospectively, often in our categories, has built into it. You know, racist assumptions, classist assumptions, gendered assumptions, and so on. So we need human involvement in this, but the argument about AI is that potentially the working together of human cognition and machine cognition can potentially take us beyond this. And this is the Golson, Seller and Taylor-Webb argument. They argue that there's now, in terms of governance, there's no outside of algorithmic decision-making and automated thinking. They're saying we can't reject AI, we've got to keep in mind human cognition and we have to think about how creatively to work them together. Now, it's like all chapters of books, there's a page and a half about this, which is where we need to go, I think, but they say we must think with and through our imbrications with other modes of cognition as a co-learning. Education is a real site, they say, where there's possibilities for synthetic governance out of AI. They argue that the controlled society of political rationality becomes one about prediction for policy and governance. This rationality can be understood as synthetic governance, an amalgamation of human classifications, human rationalities, human values, human calculative practices on the one hand, the new algorithms, data infrastructures on the other. Now, they're very positive about the potential for AI to get us somewhere where we want to go and beyond the reproduction of class, race, gender disadvantages through schooling systems. And here they draw really heavily, and Sam Seller knows a lot about this. I've talked to him, he showed me all the videos, and many of you probably know the example in 2016 where the ancient game of AlphaGo and the second strongest player in the world, Lee Sedol, was put up in a 5-match competition to play against DeepMind, a technology company, their AlphaGo program. I mean, it was a new version with AI. I remember back in, I think it was 97, that Kasparov played chess against the IBM computer. This example, so the DeepMind's AlphaGo program wins the first game. The second game, it's to the 37th move, and Sedell goes for a toilet break. The program had done their moves taking 1 to 2 minutes. It took 12 minutes for move 37. And when he came back, he was shocked. And all the discussion subsequently was that the solution and the way this program won the game, that the human couldn't think of it. It was all the data that was put in, algorithms learning from others. And they used that to suggest that perhaps AI might lead us to a way, potentially early intervention in schooling, whatever that means, and it might lead us to interrupt the reproduction of inequalities and so on. And A.R. Olby, in his book on machine habitus, and talks about the coming together of human habitus and machine habitus, and how our cultural dispositions and propensities are built into machine learning. And the potential, the first point is the one I think about the data reflecting the moments in which it was collected, and how AI, machine learning, machine habitus reproducing those. But this is their latter point, which is a similar one to the one that Golson et al. Make. When used differently, artificial intelligence systems and learning machines can become amazing tools for solving socially relevant problems, cultivating social relations, preserving local cultures, reducing social inequalities, and improving the life of communities, unquote. Now, there's 3 big elephants in the room, I think, in terms of what I've been talking about, and I haven't touched on. And just to draw to a close, so we have some time for questions, I think the 3 big elements in the room are growing inequality globally and within nations, under the dominance of a neoliberal flowing global ideology. What's that mean in terms of schooling? If you look at PISA data from 2000 to the present, particularly for the member nations, and this is absolutely true for Australia, and policymakers, politicians, media are silent on it, that the correlation between socioeconomic background and performance has strengthened across that time. And it's strengthened for all OECD countries in the context of broader growing inequality. And where does our research fit in there? And certainly policy, which wants to neglect that, I think, and see all the solution in doing more things to teachers I think is not going to get us where we need and want to go. And there's implications for our research, I think. And that is linked to the things I've been talking about. Changing global national relations, the digitalisation, the datification, and so on. The big silence in what I've said, the big elephant in the room, is the Anthropocene, the climate crisis. I kept thinking, I get on a plane in Australia, fly 14 hours to Dubai, 3 hours, and I do a 1 hour talk and go home. What have I contributed to? There are really our research. What about all that latter stuff? I mean, what do the production of these and do in terms of the resources we have? So I think there's a huge set of questions around that for our research. And I think that Jeremy Rapperly and Komatsu paper in comparative education, where they actually raise questions about what does a recognition of climate emergency and the finite of resources on this planet mean for the educational research we do, the topics, the focus, the theories, the methodologies. And of course the final one is COVID, a global phenomenon, but I think we saw some closing of borders. The point about polymorphous nature of borders now in terms of global national relations and so on. And I think yesterday's keynote in here, looking at the impact of COVID on teachers and their work and the implications of that in the context of Portugal. But I think the things talked about apply in many other societies. So my last point is that as the world changes, our theories and methodologies must, our topics must, the focus must. I think we must reject epistemological innocence. We're in this, how are we in it? And it's this first point made a long time ago by Bourdieu and Kant. We need to question and constantly challenge methodological and theoretical prescriptions. Social research is something much too serious and much too difficult for us to allow ourselves to mistake scientific rigidity, which is the nemesis of intelligence and invention, for scientific rigour, and thus to deprive ourselves of this or that resource available in the full panoply of traditions of our discipline. But I think there's new ones appearing and new ones that we need. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And we do have some time for questions, comments, and John here. Is there a microphone in the room?
Anyone else would like to join the conversation now? You can do it after this.
There it is. Thanks, Bob, for a wonderful presentation. I would like to put you a little on the latter part of this interesting going beyond ethics of probability and possibility, where it's hard to find out are we going towards a utopia, a dystopia? And I would like to ask you more concretely, relating to the purpose of education, what would be a vision of Bildung or liberal arts in a larger sense, both at the societal, political, and individual, in the light of mass stratification, in the sense that how do we avoid getting so obsessed with the screen and all the prostheses that we end up becoming the cyborg where the human has disappeared? And what happens in the relationship between the real on one hand and the screen on the other hand, when we slip into edutainment? What happens to our kids when the real becomes too boring? When we see every day parents walking their dogs and their child, not talking to them, but being consumed in what Baudrillard would call ingrowing obesity, with the screen, when you can't even take a walk or a jogging in the forest and have all the aesthetic parts of nature, existential parts of the experience, but you're consumed with apps and step counters and so on and so forth. Are there ways to think of the purpose of education and building that could deal with that, or do we just have to go along with this capitalist version of digitalization?
Thanks, John. An easy question. And we've been talking all week, so this is... your first question, John, about dystopia, utopia, I think is a really interesting one. Because my tendency when thinking about the things I talked about in the second part of the talk was to fear, the sort of surveillance capitalism and that moving into. Then I talked to Carl Goff and Sam Seller, and they had some sort of optimism that we might be able to get out of things through machine learning and move to some better. But my view is that the human always has to be in there. And I think in terms of building, I've always loved the notion, because it's much more than teaching. And I think that the future of education, the recent UNESCO report, goes some way to trying to constitute that in the current time. And I think that's why we need to hold on to it, juxtaposed against the things that the OECD are doing. But I take your point. I'm shocked, and it probably happens to each of you. Each day my phone tells me how much time I've spent on it. And I'm shocked, really shocked. Yeah, so I don't know. I would want to say we as humans collectively and democratically need to decide what schooling should be and how it should go. But there might be some things that come out of these developments if we have sensible people who are the politicians and the policy makers. And one of the things I think, look, in my state of Queensland, the data infrastructure was built by the government, not private. But in other parts of Australia, the data infrastructures were built by private edu-business, ed-tech companies for profit. And what sort of categories do they want? And should they be determining central matters that link to the governance of systems? So I think there's so many questions here. And I can't, but I think the question of what is building in this context, I think is something that we could run a conference on. But I think really telling questions, John, and when I talk to those younger colleagues, I think they think I'm sort of some throwback to the Ice Age, when I want to talk about the human in all of this, because they see that, well, the human is in it. And it's not a question of machine cognition or human cognition, it's how we can progressively work them together. Not a good answer to your very difficult question. Thank you for the question.
Thank you very much for this wonderful talk. My name is Susanne Weber, Marburg University, Germany. Thank you very much for bringing in those critical perspectives, and really like what you're talking about. So just to connect to what we just discussed now, I was wondering how you would connect not only at this political level as well, or what we should do and how we should position ourselves as researchers, but where would you see maybe the ontological perspectives, having this debate on posthumanism, and there's of course different streams of posthumanism in there. So I don't know, I just wondered whether you possibly could connect to this debate in a way, and where you would see this in this field. Thanks so much.
I think posthumanism, new materialism, particular manifestations like science and technology studies can help us understand a lot of these things very well. Politically, it's very interesting. In Australia, myself with a couple of other colleagues, were commissioned by the national body and a state body of the teacher unions to survey teachers across the nation about what they thought of the things I've been talking about in the latter part. And you know, we also left space at the end, open-ended, and we got more open-ended responses. And in particular, teachers in one state where the data infrastructure is run by an ed tech company expressed the deepest concerns that data about the young people they taught was on this data infrastructure controlled by a private company, and was there on selling of this, monetisation of it, what, you know. And I've studied a case in New York where opposition during Obama's time raced to the top. You got federal money if you developed state-level data infrastructure around schooling. 11 states got together to do this, but Pearson was the company that was going to do it. And there was a rise of parental opposition to this. It's been documented really nicely in an article by Bolger, where the parent opposition to a private company having data across potentially the life school careers of their children. They were outraged by it, and more and more money was put in by Pearson, but it was defeated, and the 11 states backed away because there was a notion that there should be a publicness, whatever that means today, about data held by a schooling system. It shouldn't be outsourced to some private company which exists for commercial profit reasons. But I think your point about new forms of theory, understanding this, I think is absolutely correct. Look, I say to my colleagues who are my age, I love reading and I read non-stop, but I find it hard to keep up with everything that's happening. Do you know what I mean? In terms of what's happening empirically in relation to these things. Because you turn around and something, another step. And the same theory and so on. I think it's really, I don't know. I suppose like all research, you freeze a moment, don't you? But I take the point that you made. It's well made.